Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the organization Save the Children doing to help children in all types of situations, especially in war zones? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on this very interesting and very important organization. My guest today is Ms. Carolyn Miles. Carolyn Miles is President and Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children. Ms. Miles joined Save the Children in 1998, and prior to becoming CEO in 2011, she was the organization's Chief Operating Officer for 7 years. Ms. Miles previously worked in Hong Kong for American Express and as an entrepreneur in the private sector. Carolyn Miles, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Great to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today. Save the Children, I'm sure our guests, our audience has heard of it for many, many years, but let's go back a little bit and talk about when was it formed, why was it formed, what's your main mission?
Sure. Well, the organization actually was formed a long time ago in 1919, and it was formed, it was founded by a woman, which was pretty unusual for that time. Women couldn't vote, they couldn't own bank accounts, but this woman, her name was Eglantine Jebb, she had a pretty radical idea, which was that children had rights. And the organization was founded on that idea that kids had rights to health, education, and protection from harm.
Those were very revolutionary concepts. Yes. Women voting, women having rights, children having rights. And of course that was right after the World War I ended in 1918, right. the end of the League of Nations, the beginning, I should say, the beginning of the League of Nations. So it was a very momentous time in many respects. Well, your organization, how large is it? How many countries do you operate in? That type of thing.
Well, it's a pretty large organization. We work in 120 countries around the world, and we have about 25,000 people who work for Save the Children. Most of them are from the countries where we work, so they're Ethiopians or Nigerians or Guatemalans, and we also work right here in the United States as well.
Now, is your organization a 501c3 that people who donate would be donating to a 501c3?
It is. It's a nonprofit organization, so they're donating to a 501c3. It's in different countries. They have different tax laws, but basically it's a charitable organization. So.
And what percentage of your budget goes to providing assistance to recipients, needy recipients such as children or whoever it may be?
So we really do focus on children, also on mothers, but in any one year it fluctuates a little bit, but generally about 85% or more of our resources go to our programs.
And of course our guests, I keep saying guests, our viewers can go to savethechildren.org.
That's right.
And tap into what we're going to talk about today. And a lot of really interesting studies that we will not get time to talk about today, but we encourage them to go to savethechildren.org. Let's talk about a recent study that just came out, just recently published, War on Children.
Yes.
What exactly is the thrust of that study that you did?
Well, this was a very comprehensive study that we wanted to do, the most comprehensive actually in decades, of the impact of war and conflict on children. And we found some, I think, pretty shocking things. The top being that there are 350 million children right now around the world that are affected and living in conflict zones. And that's a huge increase from just 20 years ago. How
do you define a conflict zone, or define conflict and a conflict zone?
Sure. Well, we define it in a couple of different ways, but it's basically children that are living in areas that are either in armed conflict. They may be areas where there's genocide or terrorism, but they are, and you'll think of some of them like Iraq, like Syria. They are countries and areas of countries where there is extensive violence, and children are living inside those that kind of violence.
So this would include areas, obviously Syria,
correct,
South Sudan, perhaps,
yes.
Even the Rohingyas being forced out of Myanmar.
Yes, so that area of Myanmar where there was conflict would definitely have been a part of this study as well. Yep.
What were some of the major findings of this study? We'll do the findings first, then we'll talk about the recommendations a bit later.
Sure. Well, I think, as I said, one of the biggest findings was that the trend of children living in conflict, that both the numbers of children and the percentage of children that are living in conflict. So 1 out of 6 children globally is living in conflict areas and being affected deeply by conflict. So the trend is really increasing in terms of both numbers of children and percentages of children. The other thing that I think is so telling is that because of the mass displacement of people, there are so many more children that are at risk. So that's another big piece of the report. And I think the third piece is that there's actually targeting of children in war these days. So it's not just keeping children out of harm's way, but people are targeting schools. You know, armed combatants are targeting schools. They're targeting hospitals, maternity hospitals, where mothers are giving birth to children. So these are pretty dramatic atrocities against children, and that really has changed over the last 20 years.
Yeah, it's really tragic. Armed combatants obviously are going to target one another,
Yes.
but when they target innocent civilians, women, children, and just passerbys, the elderly, whomever, and to focus on them to try to kill them, to create havoc. I know Boko Haram has been doing that to some degree, and many other groups too. What do you think? Has there been more of an international outcry? I know the United Nations is beefed up. They've been trying to help improve the situation. Of course, they see that the demand is growing, just like you are, I'm sure,
Yep.
and the resources are shrinking, so it makes it more difficult. But has there been more of an international effort to try to deal with these problems?
Well, of course, that's why we wrote the report and why we did the research, to try to bring more awareness. And the War on Children report is really to drive that awareness. And there are many others that are working with us to try to drive that awareness, including UN agencies and other NGOs that work in these countries where you see so much impact on children who are living in conflict. I mean, another trend that's happened that's driving this is that war now is in very populated areas. So it's no longer in kind of segregated areas where there aren't big civilian populations. So to your point, this targeting of civilians, part of that has to do with where those wars are taking place.
And it makes it much more devastating.
Yep.
Instead of being in the hinterlands of Colombia or someplace like that, you've got it in downtown, whatever the city may be, Fallujah or whatever the city.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So it makes it even more damaging. Do you find that there's one group that's been targeted, children anyway,
Yes.
for years and years, for decades really, has been child soldiers. Has there been a decrease in that particular area? Are they using fewer child soldiers? I know the UN has been working on this and
Yes.
many other groups, and
Yes.
they've extricated a large number of these child soldiers.
I think there's more attention to this issue of child soldiers and in terms of rehabilitating children and getting them out of conflict zones. But I have to say there has not been a decrease in the recruitment of children in a lot of these places. CAR, the DRC, South Sudan, that this is a huge problem in terms of recruitment of children, and as young as 12, 13-year-old children.
Now, I know many of our viewers will go to your website to read this report. Who will be the recipients of this report so that it gets into the hands, hopefully, of policymakers
Yes.
who can implement policies, who can bring resources to bear, who can help mobilize other groups to focus on this horrific problem and try to at least reduce it to some degree? But who will be the major recipients of this?
So the major recipients, we're really targeting both governments of the countries where the conflicts are happening, because there are obviously things that can be done inside those countries. Also, global capitals in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, in countries where there's influence on these kinds of issues, and trying to get the word out. And then also the general public. I mean, there is the ability, particularly now with social media and digital media, that the public actually can really raise their voices on these issues. And so that's an important part of what we want to do with this report.
Now, you and I, we did this taping about 5-6 years ago,
Yes.
something like that. And so you've had a marked increase in your budget. You've had a marked increase in the demands on your budget
Yes.
too, without a doubt. Have you had a marked increase as far as membership and people participating with you?
We have. I mean, we certainly have many more advocates, donors, those that read our reports and go to our website and become involved in Save the Children. But as you and I were talking about, the number of emergencies and the number of crises in the world right now is just at an unbelievably all-time high. And most people, they hear about Syria and they hear about the Rohingya and they hear about those issues. There's many emergencies that Save the Children responds to, smaller scale conflicts, smaller scale flooding and disasters that no one ever hears about. And last year, about 160 emergencies that we responded to during just that year.
That's a good point. We do read a lot about Syria. We do read a lot about South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo. What are some of these smaller emergencies that we're talking about? Are these mostly from conflict, or are they also from natural disasters, or a combination of both?
It's definitely both. You know, you have extensive flooding, for example, in places like India, that some of which happens on a cyclical basis. But for example, this year, while we were having hurricanes here in the United States, there was huge flooding in Southeast Asia at the same time, and a lot of times that gets lost with particularly here in the United States when people are not focusing on the rest of the world. So some of it's natural disasters, and then of course there are conflicts, and you know, places like South Sudan don't get, or Somalia, where there's, you know, Boko Haram and other armed groups, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria. Those are conflicts that kind of come up and go down in the media, and people might pay attention for a little while, but they're ongoing. The fighting keeps going. Those conflicts are continuing to rage, and children, as I said, are oftentimes caught in those conflicts.
One group we're hearing a lot more about, excuse me, and we're going to hear a lot more about in the future, are climate change refugees. This is a major problem. Many scientists around the world and political leaders too believe climate change is our #1 problem in the world. Do you factor in, do you look at these folks, for example, who are being forced out, excuse me, from their areas because of desertification, or we see Cape Town, South Africa, within the next 2 or 3 months, unless they get some rain, is going to run out of water. This is a major crisis for millions of people in that area. And it's not just Cape Town. There are many other areas that are experiencing the same type of situation. But do you bring in climate change? Do you focus on climate change refugees when we're talking about people? They're not exactly a conflict zone where you're shooting at each other, but it's certainly conflicting in that area.
Yeah, it's a huge problem for Save the Children. And in the last 8 months, I've been to Somalia, Kenya, and then just in this month, Malawi. All of them are experiencing severe drought, very extensive drought, much deeper droughts than they had before. And that does bring up, as you said, first of all, it brings up a lot of displacement. So in Somalia, I was in the northern part of Somalia, in Somaliland, and many people have had to, they're pastoralists. They move their animals from one place to the other, but at some point you run out of places to take your animals. And so they then are faced with the death of those animals, which is their whole livelihood is wrapped up in those animals. And so then they have absolutely no resources. So Save the Children often comes in at that point in terms of emergency relief, but we're really trying to do more resiliency building with communities. So pastoralists, for example, are there other crops that they can grow that will give them a fallback when there is such drought that the livestock, you know, is not able to survive? What are the other options that they have? And so spending a lot of time, and those cycles are faster and faster and faster. So there's no time for those families to recover. So we are spending a lot of time on that issue.
Exactly, yes.
Yep.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has some type of intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you like our shows and you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at a very unique organization, Save the Children, and what it's doing to provide assistance to children, especially those who are caught up in horrific conflicts in many areas around the world. My guest today is an expert on this organization. My guest today is Ms. Carolyn Miles. Ms. Carolyn Miles is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children. Carolyn, we were talking in general terms about your recommendations, your findings. Before we leave that report, are there any recommendations that you would like to make for us to contemplate to help deal with this particular problem?
There are, and in the report we call for several recommendations. The first one is how do we prevent these conflicts? So really focusing on peace and stabilization in some of these particularly fragile states and countries. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, there are international laws about targeting of children and schools and hospitals. And so really raising our voices about upholding those laws, holding people accountable, armed combatant groups, governments, holding them accountable for not upholding those laws. So making sure that there is some calling out of those and some actual actions against those who break those laws. And then finally, for children who have been caught in this kind of conflict and are so traumatized from these kinds of experiences, more attention to helping those children recover. And we see, a real increase in mental health issues, whether you're talking about Syrian children or children in Somalia who have been really traumatized by these conflicts.
Now, you mentioned that Save the Children was formed in 1919. You're fast approaching your centennial anniversary.
Yes.
Do you have anything special planned for that particular stretch of time?
Well, we do. We want to celebrate a little bit that we've been around for 100 years, but mostly what we want to do is set our sights on the next 100 years for children and do some really important things on our 3 goals. So our 3 goals are ending the preventable deaths of kids under 5, making sure every child gets a high quality basic education, and protecting kids from harm. So we're going to try to lift up those issues and talk about some specific things like pneumonia, which kills 1 million children every single year. So of those 5.5 million that die every year under the age of 5 from preventable things, almost 1 million are from pneumonia, and that's something that's totally treatable. So we're really going to lift up those issues and talk to people about what can be done to kick off that next 100 years.
And as you mentioned, so many of these problems are treatable, they're preventable. It's just a matter of having the will and the wallet to put into these programs. And we see that they can be done. One thing we haven't talked about, and we normally try to fit it in, is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. 17 logical, practical, measurable goals to eliminate poverty by 2030, to eliminate hunger, to reverse climate change. Are there certain ones that we won't go through all 17, but are there 2 or 3 that, we need more than a half hour, but are there 2 or 3 that tie directly into your programs?
There are. So there are quite a few. Actually, there's an SDG on health, and so that's where our child survival issue really falls. There's one on education, and so our education piece, and then there's also one on humanitarian response. But there are also these cross-cutting goals. So, for example, SDG number 5, which is on women and girls, and we look at an issue like that and gender, something that cuts across all of the SDGs we focus on. And it really ties into our focus on the most deprived children. And sadly, in much of the work that we do, that points to girls. They're at the end of the line, whether it's on healthcare or education or protection in emergencies. So lifting that piece up and looking at those cross-cutting goals like gender is also important.
And these, of course, are the most vulnerable of the vulnerable.
They are.
Unfortunately, they're the ones who bear the brunt of so many of these wars, so many of these problems, financial collapses, and just on across the board. Well, now, if our viewers go to your website, savethechildren.org, they're going to see your board of directors, a very impressive group. One person who jumps out from the board is Dr. Jill Biden, who is the former Second Lady of the United States, married to the former Vice President, Joe Biden. What is her involvement? I know she's been a great advocate for education, but what is her main area of interest in being on your board?
Yeah, well, certainly education. I mean, she's a teacher. Actually, she teaches and taught all the time through when she was Second Lady at a community college in Virginia. She's very dedicated to education and obviously to the future of children. So for for her, Save the Children is a natural because this is a passion for her. And her particular focus has been a lot on education and girls' education, and also on the educational issues we have here in the United States. So she's been a great spokesperson for that work. But she travels everywhere. She was just in Puerto Rico to see the programs that we're doing in the aftermath of the hurricane there. So she's been a fantastic spokesperson and obviously is able to get a lot of attention on these issues for children, whether it's in crisis or whether it's our regular education programs.
That's a good point. I was going to ask you about some of the specifics of some of the programs that you're operating. Let's just take Puerto Rico, which was devastated from Hurricane Maria that came through there. What types of programs do you provide to help alleviate some of the horrific conditions there?
Well, you know, in the immediate aftermath of an emergency, it's very basic. It's about food, it's about water, it's very basic baby supplies. You know, for us, again, it always goes back to children. So what do children need? So we were doing diapers and baby food and water and very basic things. But then we relatively quickly in Puerto Rico moved to education. And a lot of people think about, well, you know, education is kind of, you have to get the real basics, but education, getting kids back into school is critically important for children after an emergency because it gives them this sense that there's something normal in their lives. And that is so important for kids to just get them back to a normal routine. So we start working on education almost immediately and trying to get schools back up and running. So in Puerto Rico, literally making sure there were schools that were able to reopen, getting generators for schools, finding the teachers, making sure the teachers were able to deal with the trauma themselves. So we do a whole training program for how you deal with trauma. First, take care of yourself as a teacher so that you're ready for your students when they come back. So that idea of education as an immediate response is actually a big part of what we try to do.
And they still have so much rebuilding to do there. It's just,
they do.
It is so tragic what's happened, and they certainly need all the assistance they can get. That's for sure.
Yes. Yeah, it was a real wake-up call, I think, for us on Puerto Rico, and I think also for the American public, frankly.
Yes, it was.
These kind of conditions existed there. So
exactly. Yes, right. Well, as you look down the road, what do you see as some of the major challenges to save the children, to children who find themselves in these areas of conflict, whatever the case might be, from armed conflict or perhaps being climate change refugees? But what do you see as 2 or 3 of the major issues or problems as we move forward?
Well, I think for Save the Children, more and more of our work is going to be in these fragile states, in conflict, in emergencies. So if you look at the trend of our work and the amount of emergency response we have been doing over the last decade, it just becomes a bigger and bigger and bigger part of what we do. So I think for us that has lots of challenges around keeping our staff safe in those kinds of environments, in responding quickly and being able to get the resources that we need quickly. So lots of issues around that area of work. I think the other trend that's really happening is the inequality in the world, and the even in countries like the United States, that inequality is growing. So those that are left behind are just falling further and further behind. And so, you know, that can mean access to technology, that can mean education attainment, and so we're seeing the ability to really close that inequality gap as a key challenge for us going forward.
And that is extremely important, because that is something we haven't talked about, this chasm of the economic divide between the haves and the have-nots, and the 1% is getting richer and the other 99% is getting poorer along the way, and that is just absolutely untenable. You cannot have a society developing like that with basically the elimination of the middle class to a large degree, or the diminution of the middle class. You've got to have a vibrant middle class. And so often we hear the adage of, well, these people should pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Well, the problem is, in most cases, they don't have boots, much less bootstraps to pull themselves up. But it's excellent that Save the Children is working on this project. You're teaming up with many of the United Nations agencies. You're working with other non-governmental organizations to try to cobble together the resources and the programs to help people who are really in dire circumstances who cannot help themselves in most cases. And it's absolutely important that people take a look at what you're doing with Save the Children. They can do that by go to savethechildren.org and participate whenever possible. But Carolyn Miles, CEO of Save the Children, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.